In the dust-choked heart of the Arizona Territory, a woman's life can be bought for the price of a deed, and a man's soul can be sold for less than the cost of a horse. Alice Caldwell, a widow with a belly full of her late husband's child and a heart full of grief, stood on the precipice of ruin. The whispers in the town of Hope's Landing said she was finished, but they didn't know the desperation that burned inside her. When the auctioneer presented a broken Apache savage, a man with eyes like shattered obsidian, a flicker of an insane idea ignited within her, a choice that would either save her or see her utterly destroyed. She was about to bid on a man, unaware that she wasn't just buying a laborer. She was bidding on a destiny she never knew she was praying for. The sun beat down on Hope's Landing with a merciless white-hot intensity, baking the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. For Alice Caldwell, the heat was a physical manifestation of the pressure suffocating her from all sides. 6 months a widow, 7 months with child, and the owner of a ranch that was bleeding money faster than a gut-shot stare. Her late husband, Thomas, a good and gentle man, had left her with a legacy of love and a mountain of debt. The Circle C ranch was all she had left of him, but running it alone was proving impossible. Hired hands were expensive and unreliable, and her dwindling savings were nearly gone. Every morning she woke with the ghost of Thomas's warmth beside her, and the cold reality of foreclosure breathing down her neck. That reality had a name: Silas Blackwood, a man with a smile as thin as a razor's edge and an appetite for land that was insatiable. He had already offered to take the burden of the ranch off her delicate shoulders for a price that was nothing short of an insult. She knew he was circling like a vulture, just waiting for her to fall. It was this desperation that had led her here to the grimmest spectacle in town, the monthly surplus auction. It was a place where failed homesteaders saw their life's work sold for pennies, and where the county auctioned off unclaimed livestock and sometimes the labor of prisoners. Alice clutched her worn reticule, the few dollars inside feeling as heavy as lead weights. She was here for a strong mule, perhaps 2 cheap farmhands whose contracts were for sale. The auctioneer, a portly man named Jebediah Smith, with a voice like gravel, was working his way through a pathetic collection of rusted plows and lame horses. Then the tone of the auction shifted. A hush fell over the crowd, a mixture of morbid curiosity and cruel anticipation. "And now, folks," Jebediah bellowed, "a special lot captured renegade found trespassing on federal land. The army doesn't want him the reservations full. So the territory has sanctioned the sale of his labor contract. 1 year of hard service to the highest bidder." 2 deputies shoved a man onto the raised platform. He wasn't just a man. He was an Apache warrior, or what was left of one. He was tall and leanly muscled, but his body was a canvas of fresh and old miseries. His face was bruised a cut above his eye, weeping blood sluggishly. One arm was bound in a crude splint, and he favored his left leg, his limp, a testament to some recent brutal encounter. He wore nothing but tattered buckskin breeches, his long black hair matted with dirt. But it was his eyes that seized Alice's breath. They were not vacant or defeated. They were black, deep, and filled with a silent, simmering fire that seemed to burn through his humiliation. He scanned the crowd of gawking faces with an unnerving stillness, a predator caught in a trap yet still dangerous. The crowd jeered. "Look at the savage," one man shouted. "What's he good for a scarecrow? I'll give you $5 for him, Jebediah," another called out, laughing. "My dog needs a new chew toy." Silas Blackwood stood near the front, a smug smirk on his face. He caught Alice's eye and gave her a condescending nod as if to say, "See what this world does to the weak." Alice felt a strange, unwelcome pang of empathy. She saw past the dirt and the blood. She saw a human being stripped of his dignity, being sold like a piece of meat. She remembered Thomas talking about the Apache not as savages, but as a people fighting for their home. They feel loss just like us, Alice. They love their children, same as we will. The bidding started low, a joke to the townsfolk. $5. 6. The numbers crept up with agonizing slowness. Alice's mind raced. Hired hands would cost her $50 a month, money she didn't have. They would be loyal only to her coin and would likely listen to the poisonous whispers of Silas Blackwood. This man would cost her almost nothing. He was brokenness, but he was not small. Beneath the injuries, there was a strength in his frame that even his captors couldn't completely beat out of him. He wouldn't run. Where would he go injured as he was? He would owe his food and shelter to her and her alone. It was a mad, desperate gamble. $20, a rancher near the back shouted. Jebediah's eyes lit up. $20 from Mr. Abernathy, a fine price for a strong back. Do I hear 25? The auction stalled. $20 was a significant sum for a savage who might slit your throat in the night. Alice's heart hammered against her ribs. Her hand, trembling, went up. $30, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Yet it cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Every head turned to stare at her. The pregnant widow. The foolish woman on the verge of losing everything. Silas Blackwood's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, then amusement. The widow Caldwell bids 30. Jebediah announced, his surprise evident. A bold move, ma'am. A bold move indeed. On the platform, the Apache's gaze found hers. For the first time, his stoic mask wavered. His dark eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with a raw, piercing intensity that seemed to look right through her, questioning the very sanity of her actions. $30 going once. Blackwood stepped forward. 35, he said smoothly, his eyes locked on Alice, a clear challenge in their depths. He didn't want the man. He wanted to see her fail to bleed her of her last penny. Alice's resolve hardened. This was no longer just about a cheap laborer. It was about defiance. It was about spitting in the face of the man who wanted to pick over the bones of her life. $50, she declared, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $50 was a fortune. It was the last of her emergency money, the funds she'd hidden away for the baby's birth. Blackwood's jaw tightened. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a short, dismissive laugh and shook his head, stepping back. He had made his point. He had forced her to spend her last dime on a broken Indian. Sold! Jebediah slammed his gavel down. To the widow Caldwell for $50. The crowd parted as she walked to the platform, their whispers following her like biting flies. She handed the money to a stunned Jebediah and signed the contract of indenture. The sheriff, a weary man named Brody, handed her a lead rope attached to the iron manacle on the Apache's wrist. "He's all yours, Mrs. Caldwell," Brody said, his tone a mixture of pity and warning. "His name for the record is Cale. That's what the soldiers called him. Be careful. He's wild." Alice took the rope, her fingers brushing against the cold iron. She looked up at the man now legally bound to her for 1 year. Kyle. He stared down at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but his eyes held a storm of emotions she couldn't begin to decipher. As she led him away from the auction block through the gawking, judgmental crowd, Alice Caldwell had never felt more alone or more terrified of the future she had just purchased. The journey back to the Circle C was a study in suffocating silence. Alice sat at the reins of her wagon, the dust clinging to her sweat-dampened dress acutely aware of the man walking behind. The rope that connected them felt like a brand searing her with the town's judgment. Kyle moved with a painful halting gait, but he did not complain. He did not speak. His presence was a heavy, unnerving weight, a silent storm cloud she had willingly brought into her home. The Circle C was nestled in a small, defensible valley, a patch of green carved out of the unforgiving landscape. The modest ranch house, built by Thomas's own hands, stood beside a sturdy barn and a well. It was beautiful, but to Alice's tired eyes, every fence that needed mending and every field that lay fallow was a monument to her failure. When they arrived, she tethered the wagon and turned to face him. "The barn," she said, her voice tight. "There's a clean stall. You can have the one at the end." Kyle's eyes flickered from her face to the house, then to the vast open land beyond. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The silence was his shield, and she had no idea how to breach it. Inside the barn, the air was warm and smelled of hay and horses. She pointed to a stall filled with fresh straw. "There's a water pump outside. You'll find a bucket." She fumbled with the key to his manacle, her fingers clumsy. As the iron cuff sprang open, his wrist was raw and chafed beneath. He didn't flinch or rub the sore flesh. He simply stood there watching her. "I expect a day's work for your keep," she said, trying to sound like a proper landowner, a woman in charge. "But you're injured. You'll rest until that arm is healed. Then we'll start with light duties." He said nothing. His gaze dropped to her swollen belly, lingered for a moment, and then returned to her face. It was not a lecherous look, but one of flat, dispassionate observation. It made her feel both vulnerable and strangely seen. For the first few days, a tense and fragile routine formed. Alice would leave a plate of food, stew bread, whatever she had, on a crate outside the barn door. Hours later, the plate would be empty. She never saw him eat. She would see him sometimes, sitting in the sliver of shade, cast by the barn, staring out at the distant mesas, his expression remote and unreadable. He moved with a stiff grace, his injuries a constant visible reminder of the violence he had endured. The silence began to wear on her. It was worse than the town's scornful whispers. It was a living thing, filling the space between the house and the barn, a void of unspoken history and mistrust. She was a woman who had shared every thought with her husband. Now her only companion was a ghost, and her only living help was a man who wouldn't even grant her a single word. One afternoon, driven by a wave of loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache, she brought his plate to the barn herself, instead of leaving it outside. He was sitting on the straw, carefully rewrapping the crude splint on his arm, with strips of leather he'd found somewhere. He paused when she entered his body, going tense. She set the plate down a few feet away from him. "Your arm," she said. "It won't heal properly like that. The bone needs to be set." Kyle's eyes, dark and wary, watched her every move. "My husband, Thomas," she began the name catching in her throat. "He was good at setting bones, cattle horses, people too. He showed me how." She took a hesitant step closer. "Let me look at it." He didn't move, but he didn't pull away either. A silent, tense negotiation passed between them. Finally, with a slow, deliberate movement, he extended his injured arm. Gently, her fingers probed the swollen flesh. She was no doctor, but she could feel the grating of bone that was not aligned. It would heal crooked, leaving him with a weak, misshapen limb. "It's not right," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "It has to be rebroken and set properly." His jaw tightened, the only sign of the pain her touch must have been causing. "I can do it," she said, meeting his gaze. "But it will hurt." He held her gaze for a long moment, a flicker of something assessment perhaps in his eyes. Then he gave another one of those short, sharp nods. It was permission. It was trust. A tiny, fragile seed of it, planted in a field of stone. That evening, by the light of a lantern in the barn, Alice performed the grim task. She gave him a thick piece of leather to bite down on, and with a deep breath and a prayer to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore, she snapped the bone back into place. A low grunt was the only sound he made, a testament to an iron will she could barely comprehend. With practiced hands, she slathered the arm in a healing salve and fashioned a new, sturdier splint from 2 flat pieces of wood and clean linen. When she was done, she was sweating her hands, shaking. He sat there, his face pale in the lamplight, his breathing ragged. He looked at his newly splinted arm, then up at her. "Why?" he asked. His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse but clear. It was the first word he had spoken to her, and it startled her so much she nearly dropped the lantern. "Why what?" she managed to ask. "Why?" he repeated, his dark eyes searching hers. "The auction. This." He gestured with his good hand to his arm, to the barn, to the plate of food now sitting cold beside him. Alice sank down onto a nearby hay bale, her body suddenly exhausted. She looked at this broken man she had tied her fate to, and for the first time she gave him the honest truth. "Because I am alone," she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her belly, "and because I am afraid. And when I looked at you on that platform, I think I saw someone who understood what it felt like to have everything taken away." He did not reply, but the silence that fell between them now was different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of her confession and the echo of his first word. In the dim light of the barn, 2 broken people, a pregnant widow and a captive warrior, had finally begun to speak the same language. News of the widow's pet Indian spread through Hope's Landing like a prairie fire. When Alice drove the wagon into town for supplies. A week later, she was met with a wall of cold shoulders and hostile glares. Women who had once offered condolences now clutched their children's hands and crossed the street to avoid her. Men at the general store fell silent when she entered their conversations, only resuming in hushed, scornful tones once her back was turned. Mr. Peterson, the store owner, measured out her flour and beans with a grim reluctance. "It ain't right, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, not meeting her eye. "Keeping a savage on your land. It's not safe, especially for a woman in your condition." "Kyle is my concern, Mr. Peterson," Alice replied, her chin held high, though her cheeks burned with shame and anger. "I'll thank you to mind yours." Her defiance only hardened their resolve against her. But the town's disapproval was a minor irritation compared to the focused, predatory attention of Silas Blackwood. He rode out to the Circle C 2 days later, dismounting from his fine black stallion, with an air of arrogant ownership. He didn't bother to knock striding onto her porch as if it were his own. "Alice," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "I had to see for myself. The whole town is in an uproar. Tell me it isn't true that you've brought that Apache renegade here." "His name is Cale," she corrected him, stepping out of the house to block his path. "And he is a worker on my ranch, legally contracted." Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A worker. My dear, you've bought a rabid dog. It's only a matter of time before he turns on you. What were you thinking?" At that moment, Cale emerged from the barn. His arm was still in the splint, but he moved with more ease now. He was carrying a broken fence post in his good hand, his eyes immediately locking on Blackwood. He stopped about 30 feet away, a silent, watchful guardian. His presence was formidable, and Blackwood's patronizing smile faltered. "I was thinking of survival, Mr. Blackwood," Alice said coolly. "Something you seem determined to deny me." Blackwood's gaze flickered between Alice and Cale, his expression darkening. "This is foolishness. That land is too much for you. The offer still stands. Sell to me. I'll give you a fair price enough to move back east and find a respectable life. My life is here. This was my husband's home, and it will be my child's home. It is not for sale." "Everything is for sale, Alice," he hissed, his charming facade finally cracking to reveal the ugliness beneath. "You're alone, vulnerable, one woman and her savage pet against the world. How long do you think you can last before something unfortunate happens? A stray fire, a cattle stampede. This is a dangerous land." The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the hot, still air between them. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Alice's skin, but she refused to let him see it. She thought of the baby growing inside her, a new life dependent entirely on her strength. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Blackwood?" He simply smiled. "I'm offering you a way out. Think about it." He turned to leave, casting one last venomous glare at Cale, who hadn't moved a muscle. "Keep your dog on a tight leash," he spat, before mounting his horse and riding away. The dust settled, leaving a tense silence in its wake. Alice's legs felt weak, and she leaned against the porch railing, her hand on her belly. Kyle walked over, stopping a respectful distance away. He looked from the direction Blackwood had ridden to her pale face. "He wants this land," Kyle stated. It wasn't a question. "He wants everything," Alice whispered. "He's been trying to buy us out since before Thomas. Since before he died." A sudden, painful thought struck her. Thomas had been killed during a cattle raid. The official report from Sheriff Brody had blamed a small band of renegade Apaches. She had never questioned it. Until now. The days that followed were filled with a low-grade dread. Blackwood's threat lingered over the ranch like a plague. But something else was happening too. A slow, steady change was taking place between her and Kyle. With his arm healing, he began to work. He couldn't do heavy lifting, but his industry was astonishing. He mended the fences with a meticulous patient skill she'd never seen. He weeded her neglected garden with his one good hand, his movements economical and efficient. He seemed to know things instinctively, how to read the weather in the clouds, where to find the best grazing grass, how to soothe her nervous mare with a low murmur and a gentle touch. He still spoke little, but his actions spoke volumes. He started leaving small tokens for her on the porch railing. A uniquely shaped stone, a colorful bird's feather, a cluster of wild herbs that, when steeped in hot water, eased the ache in her back. They were small, silent gestures of something. Care, respect, friendship. She in turn found herself watching him, learning the rhythm of his quiet existence. She learned that the rigid set of his jaw meant he was in pain, and that a certain stillness in his posture meant he was listening intently to the sounds of the wilderness. She began to see the man beneath the scars, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the profound sadness that seemed to cling to him like a shroud. One evening, as she sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, he approached and sat on the ground nearby. For a long while, they watched the day die in comfortable silence. "You are not a rancher," he said suddenly. She looked at him surprised. "What do you mean, this is my ranch?" "Your hands," he said, nodding toward them. "They are soft. You hold a hoe like it is a snake. Your husband, he worked the land. You worked the house." She couldn't deny it. Thomas had cherished her, insisted she focus on making the house a home while he broke his body on the land. "He wanted to protect me from this life," she said softly. "No one can be protected from life," Kyle replied, his voice low. "Only prepared for it." He looked at her belly. "The child will need more than soft hands to survive here." His words were blunt, but they held no malice. It was a simple, hard truth. In that moment, Alice realized he wasn't just working for her. He was teaching her. Every fence he mended, every task he completed, he did so in a way that she could watch and learn. He was preparing her. The thought was so unexpected, so deeply touching that it left her speechless. The vulture was circling, but here in the quiet twilight, she realized she might have just found a guardian. The summer deepened, and the heat became a relentless, suffocating blanket over the valley. The creek that watered the Circle Sea dwindled to a muddy trickle, and the pastures turned a sickly shade of brown. The drought was a slow, creeping death, and it threatened to finish what Silas Blackwood had started. Alice watched her small herd of cattle grow thin and listless, their ribs showing through their hides. The well near the house was running dangerously low. Despair began to gnaw at her again, a familiar, unwelcome companion. One morning, she found Cale standing by the dry creek bed, his head tilted, as if listening to the earth itself. He spent hours walking the property, his eyes scanning the landscape, reading it like a book, written in a language she didn't understand. That afternoon, he came to the house. "There is water," he said, his voice certain. "Not here. High up. In the rocks." "High up?" she asked, following his gaze toward the rocky mesas that bordered the north end of her property. "Thomas said that land was useless. Nothing but rock and scrub." "Your husband saw with a farmer's eyes," Kyle replied. "He looked for soil. He did not look for what is hidden beneath." He picked up a shovel with his good hand. "I will show you." For 2 days, Alice watched as Kyle worked under the blistering sun. His arm was mostly healed, and he had removed the splint, though he still favored it. With a focus that was almost religious in its intensity, he dug at the base of a specific rock formation she had never paid any mind to. He worked methodically, leveraging rocks out of the way, his lean body glistening with sweat. She brought him water, which he accepted with a quiet nod, his eyes never losing their focus. On the evening of the second day, he called to her. His voice was calm, but it held an undercurrent of triumph. She hurried over her heart, pounding with a fragile hope. He stood beside a hole not much wider than a barrel. At the bottom, in the deepening twilight, she saw it a dark, unmistakable gleam. Water. "It is a seep," he explained, "an underground spring that finds its way through the rock. It will not be a river, but it will be enough. For the cattle, for the house." Tears sprang to Alice's eyes, tears of such profound relief that they stole her breath. This was more than just water. It was a lifeline. It was survival. "How did you know?" she whispered, looking at him with a sense of awe. "My people have always known," he said simply. "The land speaks to those who listen." The discovery of the spring shifted the foundation of their relationship. He was no longer just the man she had bought, the hired hand, the object of the town's scorn. He was her partner in survival, the man who had saved her ranch. The barn no longer seemed a fitting place for him. That night she cleaned out the small spare room in the house the one Thomas had used as a study. It wasn't much, just a cot, a small table and a window that looked out onto the valley, but it was a room within the walls of her home. She found him by the barn, cleaning his shovel. "Kyle," she said, her voice a little unsteady. "The barn is for animals. You are not an animal. There's a room in the house. It's yours." He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. He seemed to consider her offer, weighing its meaning. Finally he nodded once. "I will bring my things," he said, though she knew he owned nothing but the clothes on his back and a small carved piece of wood he sometimes held. Living under the same roof, the small spaces of the house forced an intimacy that both terrified and thrilled her. They began to share meals at the small kitchen table, the silence between them, now comfortable, punctuated by the small sounds of living. In the evenings she would read from her Bible, her voice soft in the lamplight, and he would sit and listen, carving a piece of cottonwood with a small knife, his hands deft and sure. One night he gestured to the book. "What does it say?" "It tells stories," she answered, "of faith and loss and love. It speaks of a promised land, a place of peace. My people have stories too," he said, his eyes distant, "of when this land was our church and the sky was our book." Hesitantly he began to speak. He told her not of battles and raids, but of his childhood. He spoke of his mother who could weave stories into baskets, and his father who taught him how to track the stars. He spoke of a younger sister with a laugh like wind chimes, and a wife he had loved, both of them, lost to the blue-coated soldiers and the sickness they brought with them. His voice was a low, steady monotone, but the grief behind the words was a chasm. Listening to him, Alice felt her own carefully constructed walls of grief begin to crumble. She found herself telling him about Thomas, about his gentle nature, and his big, clumsy hands, about their shared dream of filling the ranch with children and laughter. They were two people from different worlds, united by the universal language of loss. As she spoke of Thomas, she cried, silent tears, tracking paths through the dust on her cheeks. Kyle did not move to comfort her, did not offer platitudes. He simply sat with her, in her sorrow, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in the storm of her memories. When her tears subsided, she looked up at him, her face puffy, her heart raw. He was watching her, his dark eyes filled with a profound and startling empathy. In that moment, the space between them vanished. She saw him not as an Apache, not as her indentured servant, but as Kyle. A man of quiet strength, of deep wounds, and of a gentleness he kept hidden from the world. And she knew with a certainty that shook her to her very soul that she was falling in love with him. It was a terrifying, impossible and undeniable truth. The love she thought had died with Thomas was being reborn quietly and stubbornly, like the spring he had found in the barren rock. The love that grew between them was a quiet, fragile thing, nurtured in shared glances across the dinner table and long, silent evenings on the porch. There was no grand declaration, no passionate embrace. It existed in the way he started leaving a bucket of fresh, cool water from the spring on the porch for her each morning, and the way she found herself mending the tear in his only shirt. It was in the protective way his gaze would follow her as she moved about her chores, her body growing heavier and slower with the advancing pregnancy. The townsfolk of Hope's Landing would have called it a sin, a perversion. But for Alice, it felt like breathing again, after months of holding her breath. Kyle's presence was a shield against her loneliness, and a balm for her fear. With him, the ranch felt less like a burden and more like a sanctuary. But their fragile peace was built upon a foundation of secrets, and one evening, the first of the terrible truths was finally unearthed. Sheriff Brody rode out to the Circle C, his face grim. He was a decent man, caught between his duty and his conscience. "Evening, Mrs. Caldwell," he said, tipping his hat. He nodded curtly at Cale, who stood silently by the barn watching. "Sheriff, Alice greeted him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong? Just a warning," Brody said, lowering his voice. "There's been talk. Silas Blackwood is stirring up trouble. He's telling folks that the Apache who raided your place and killed Thomas might be coming back. Says they were part of the same band as—" He trailed off, glancing uncomfortably at Kyle. "As him." A cold dread washed over Alice. "That's a lie. Kyle was a prisoner when I bought him." "I know that," Brody said, sighing. "And you know that. But folks are scared. Fear makes them stupid. Blackwood is using that. He's petitioning the territorial judge to have your contract nullified, to have Cale removed for the safety of the community. He's trying to leave you all alone out here, Alice. Be careful." After the sheriff left, a heavy silence descended. The lie Blackwood was spreading was poisonous, designed to isolate her completely. She looked over at Kyle, who was staring after the sheriff, his face a mask of cold fury. Later that night, as a storm gathered over the mesas, rumbling in the distance, Alice found him sitting on the porch, staring out into the darkness. The lie had created a chasm between them, a resurgence of the old mistrust. The raid that had killed Thomas had always been the unspoken horror in her past. The thought that Kyle could in any way be connected to it, even by false association, was a knife to her heart. "Was it your people?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The ones who killed my husband?" Kyle turned his head slowly to look at her. In the faint light from the house, his face was etched with a pain that mirrored her own. "There are many Apache bands. Some are at peace. Some are at war. I cannot speak for all of them." His answer was honest, but it wasn't enough. She needed to know. "But you—" She pressed her voice, breaking. Were you there?" He was silent for a long time, the only sound the rising wind. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the story he had clearly carried for a long time. "I was there," he said, and her world tilted on its axis. She felt the blood drain from her face. "You—" "No," he said quickly, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "I did not ride with them. I was hunting them." Alice sank onto the porch swing, her mind reeling. "Hunting them? Why?" "The men who raided your ranch," he said, his voice a low, bitter rasp. "They were not Apache." She stared at him, confused. "But the sheriff, the tracks, they said it was an Apache raid." "One man was Apache," Cale clarified. "A man named Chayton. A disgrace to our people, an outcast who guided white men for money and whiskey. He rode with them, taught them how to leave signs that would point to us. But the men who held the guns, the men who killed your Thomas, they were white men. Outlaws." He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. "They raided my camp 3 nights before they came here. They were looking for silver, but they took something more. They took my wife. They took my sister." His voice broke on the last words, a raw, exposed nerve of grief. "I tracked them. I was close. I heard the gunshots at your ranch. By the time I got here, they were gone. Your husband he was already gone. I found their trail, but they ambushed me the next day. They beat me, left me for dead. That is where the soldiers found me." The story settled over Alice, a horrifying, suffocating blanket of truth. Thomas hadn't been killed by savages in some random act of frontier violence. He had been murdered by criminals, white men, whose crime had been deliberately blamed on the Apache. And this man, Kyle, had lost his family to the very same monsters. Their tragedies were not separate events. They were intertwined 2 threads in the same brutal tapestry. "Who were they?" she whispered, her hands clenched in her lap. "They were led by a man with a voice like oil and a soul of a snake. Cale said, his eyes burning with a cold, pure hatred. A man who rode a fine black stallion. A man who wanted this land, this water. The pieces clicked into place in Alice's mind with a sickening finality. The constant pressure to sell, the veiled threats, the convenient Apache raid that left her widowed and vulnerable, the lies he was spreading now. Silas Blackwood. She breathed the name, tasting like poison. Kyle nodded. He was the one who gave the orders. The storm finally broke rain, lashing against the house in a furious torrent, mirroring the tempest in Alice's soul. The man she had been falling in love with was not connected to her husband's death by guilt, but by shared tragedy. They were bound by a common enemy. The grief she had carried for months was suddenly sharpened by a new powerful emotion, a burning, all-consuming desire for justice. And she knew she would not be fighting for it alone. The revelation of Blackwood's treachery transformed the atmosphere at the Circle C. The quiet melancholy was replaced by a tense, focused energy. Grief gave way to a cold, hard resolve. Alice and Kyle were no longer just a widow and her hired hand. They were allies, bound by a shared enemy and a thirst for retribution. The love that had been a gentle budding thing now took on the strength of forged steel, tempered in the fires of their mutual pain. They knew Blackwood would not wait for the law. His attempt to have Cale removed was just the first move. When that failed, as Sheriff Brody had quietly assured them, it would, for lack of any real evidence, Blackwood's methods would become more direct. The unfortunate accidents he had threatened were no longer a vague possibility, but an imminent certainty. "He will come here," Kyle said one evening as they cleaned and oiled Thomas's old rifle and shotgun. His hands, now fully healed, moved with an expert familiarity with the weapons. "He cannot let us live knowing what we know." "Then we will be ready for him," Alice replied, her voice steady. She was surprised by her own lack of fear. The terror that had plagued her for months had been burned away, leaving only a fierce, protective instinct for her home, her unborn child, and the man who now stood beside her. Under Cale's guidance, they began to fortify the ranch. It was a race against time. He taught her things she never imagined she would need to know. He showed her how to reinforce the doors and window shutters of the small house. He identified the best defensive positions, the natural choke points in the valley where attackers would be most vulnerable. He was not just a ranch hand. He was a warrior, and he was preparing their small patch of land for a war. He took her out to a secluded canyon and taught her how to shoot the rifle. At first, the weapon was heavy and awkward in her hands, the kick of it bruising her shoulder. But Kyle was a patient teacher. "Do not fight the gun," he instructed, his voice low, as he stood behind her, adjusting her stance. "Become part of it. Breathe. Squeeze the trigger, do not pull it. Let the shot be a surprise to you." His proximity was both comforting and electric. She could feel the warmth of his body, smell the scent of sage and leather that clung to him. In these moments of intense focus, their bond deepened beyond words. He was entrusting her with the skills of survival, and she was placing her life and her child's life in his hands. As she practiced, her aim grew steady. The fear of the gun was replaced by a grim competence. She was no longer Thomas's delicate wife who worked only in the house. She was Alice Caldwell, a woman of the West, a woman preparing to defend her own. Their days were spent in hard labor, their nights in quiet preparation. They stockpiled water and food in the root cellar. Kyle laid subtle traps, tripwires made of vine pits, disguised with brush, along the most likely paths of approach. He moved with the silent efficiency of a ghost, turning their peaceful valley into a subtle, deadly fortress. During this time, the last of the barriers between them crumbled. One night, exhausted from a day of reinforcing the barn walls, Alice looked at him across the small kitchen table. "Thomas would have liked you," she said softly. "He admired men of honor." "He was a good man," Kyle replied, his eyes meeting hers. "To die for land he loved. That is an honorable death." He paused, his expression softening. "But to live for those you love is a greater honor." The unspoken meaning hung in the air between them. He wasn't just fighting for vengeance or for the ranch. He was fighting for her, for the child. Later, as she lay in her bed, the baby kicking restlessly inside her, she heard a soft sound outside her door. She opened it to find Kyle standing there, a blanket in his hands. "I will sleep here," he said, gesturing to the floor in the hallway outside her room. "Closer, in case they come in the night." It was a simple, protective gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was an admission of his devotion, a vow to stand between her and any danger. She reached out her hand, resting on his arm, the hard muscle beneath his shirt, a reassuring presence. "Thank you, Kyle," she whispered. He looked down at her hand, then met her eyes. In their dark depths, she saw everything he could not say, his fierce loyalty, his deepening affection, his sorrow for the past, and his hope for a future with her. Slowly he raised his free hand and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was the first time he had touched her with such tenderness. The touch was a promise. In the quiet darkness of the house, with the threat of violence looming outside, they found their peace not in words, but in a shared, silent understanding. They were ready. The storm was coming, and they would face it together. The attack came not in the dead of night, but in the grey, misty hour just before dawn. The chirping of crickets ceased abruptly, a sudden, unnatural silence that was more alarming than any sound. It was Kyle who heard it first. He was instantly awake, moving from his spot in the hallway to her bedside like a shadow. "They are here," he whispered, his voice calm and lethal. Adrenaline sharp and cold shot through Alice's veins. She was not panicked. She was ready. They had rehearsed this. She pulled on her boots and grabbed the shotgun from beside the bed, its weight familiar and grimly comforting. Kyle was already at the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. "6 of them," he reported. "Blackwood is with them. They are spreading out, trying to surround the house." "The barn," Alice said, her mind racing. "If they set fire to the barn, we'll be trapped, silhouetted against the flames." "They will," Kyle agreed. "It is what I would do." He handed her the rifle. "Stay here. By this window. You can see the path from the creek. Shoot anything that moves on that path. Do not hesitate." "Where are you going?" she asked, her heart seizing with fear for him. "Blackwood will not expect me to leave the house. He thinks I am a cornered animal. I will be the hunter, not the hunted." Before she could protest, he slipped out the back door and vanished into the pre-dawn gloom, as silent as the mist itself. Alice's hands were slick with sweat as she took her position. The waiting was agonizing. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then she saw them. 2 men moving in a low crouch toward the barn carrying torches. Her breath caught in her throat. These were the men who had murdered her husband, who had destroyed Cale's family. "Breathe. Squeeze. Let the shot be a surprise." Cale's words echoed in her mind. She raised the rifle, rested the barrel on the windowsill, and took aim at the first man. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the gun was deafening. In the small house, the kick slamming into her shoulder. The man screamed and dropped his torch, clutching his leg. The second man, startled, hesitated for a fatal second. From the darkness near the woodpile, An arrow hissed through the air and embedded itself in his chest. He crumpled to the ground without a sound. Gunshots erupted from the other side of the house. Bullets thudded into the thick wooden walls. They knew where she was now. From his horse, safely out of range, Silas Blackwood shouted, "Burn it! Burn the whole damn place to the ground!" Another man with a torch ran toward the house from the front. Alice swiveled, reloaded, and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to make him dive for cover. The battle became a chaotic symphony of violence. A shout from the darkness, followed by the sickening thud of a body hitting the ground. A flash of gunfire from the trees. Alice fired again and again, her shots methodical, aimed not necessarily to kill, but to keep them back, to keep them from setting the fires that would be their doom. She was a mother bear defending her den, a primal fury driving her actions. She heard a crash from the front porch and knew they were trying to break down the door. She loaded the shotgun, its wider spread more useful at close range. The heavy door shuddered, the wood splintering around the lock. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the morning air, followed by another. Then silence. The assault on the door stopped. Peeking through a crack, Alice saw Cale. He moved through the remaining outlaws like a spirit of vengeance. He was no longer the quiet, gentle man who carved wood and tended her garden. He was a warrior in his element, a whirlwind of calculated deadly motion. Thomas's old hunting knife was in one hand, a tomahawk in the other. He fought not with wild rage, but with a cold, terrifying precision. The outlaws who had come expecting to terrorize a lone woman found themselves facing a nightmare. It was over in minutes. The surviving gunmen, seeing their companions fall, broke and ran melting back into the wilderness. Only one man remained. Silas Blackwood sat on his horse, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, his pistol aimed at the house. Kyle walked slowly into the open, his weapons dripping, his eyes locked on Blackwood. "It is over," Kyle called out, his voice ringing with authority. "Not until I have that land, you savage." Blackwood screamed, his voice cracking with madness. He spurred his horse forward, raising his pistol, but he wasn't aiming at Cale. He was aiming at the window where he knew Alice was. Everything seemed to slow down. Alice saw the gun barrel swing toward her. She saw Kyle's body tense as he realized Blackwood's target. He wouldn't reach him in time. But Blackwood had forgotten about the woman with the rifle. Alice didn't think. She acted. She raised her own rifle one last time, the sight finding Blackwood's chest. She breathed out, squeezed the trigger, and the world exploded in a final deafening roar. Silas Blackwood was thrown from his saddle, a look of utter shock on his face, a dark stain spreading across his fine white shirt. He hit the ground and lay still. Silence descended upon the valley, broken only by the cawing of a distant crow and the sound of Alice's own ragged breathing. The sun began to crest the mesas, its golden light spilling across the yard, illuminating the grim tableau of the battle. Kyle ran to the house, throwing open the back door. Alice met him in the kitchen, and they collapsed into each other's arms. She buried her face in his chest, inhaling his scent, the smell of sweat and battle and life. He held her tightly, his hand protectively on her back, his body shielding hers from the carnage outside. "It's over," she whispered, the words choked with tears of relief and exhaustion. "It is finished," he corrected her gently, holding her face in his hands. He looked at her, his eyes full of awe and a love so profound it took her breath away. "My warrior woman." In the bloody dawn, standing in the ruins of their old life, Alice Caldwell and Cale knew they had not just survived. They had won. They had faced the darkness together and emerged into the light, their future, like the rising sun, finally their own. A future they would build, not on a foundation of shared grief, but on the unshakable bedrock of their love. And so, in the heart of a land that had tried its best to break them, Alice and Cale began to build a new life. The arrival of Sheriff Brodie and his deputies was a formality. The evidence of Blackwood's guilt lay scattered in the morning sun. The town of Hope's Landing, faced with the undeniable truth, fell into a stunned, shamed silence. Alice and Cale became a legend, whispered on the wind, the pregnant widow and the Apache warrior who had stood against darkness and won. Months later, as the first winter snows dusted the mesas, the cries of a newborn baby echoed through the small ranch house. Alice held her son a child with her eyes, and the quiet, fierce spirit of the two men who had loved her. Kyle stood beside them, no longer a captive or a servant, but a husband and a father, his hand resting gently on the baby's head. They had found in each other not what they had lost, but something new, a family forged in fire, a love that was a sanctuary, proving that even in the most broken of places, the most beautiful things can grow. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the unforgiving West. If Alice and Cale's story of courage and unexpected love touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a story of resilience and hope against all odds. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next real-life drama. Your support allows us to keep telling these incredible stories. Until next time, stay strong and keep fighting for the love you deserve.